evening, everybody. Thank you very much for coming out tonight. I am Edie, Chair of Northport Friends of Wildlife, and of course you're here to hear from Jono Miller, who will talk about the history of Northport. Before we do that, I'd like to touch on a few things. First, I would like to welcome Linda Yates, Commissioner Linda Yates of Northport, and our newly elected Debbie McDowell, Commissioner. So I'd like to start these talks when I can remember to mention our vision statement, which is Northport Friends of Wildlife believes in the possibility of assimilating urban development with Northport's wildlife. So that's a lofty ambition, but there is a lot of wildlife in Northport, and we feel it needs to be protected, so that's what we're trying to do. And how do we do that? We have talks at the library. We are having our talks October through May on a monthly basis, and it always ties into the environment in some aspect. And we do have the lineup right here on the table in the plastic sleeves, so you can see the topics and who will be speaking. And we also get involved with community projects to the extent we can. We're fairly new. We've been in an organization now for about 2 years. So one thing that I'm proud of to talk about, and that's what we've done with our gopher tortoises, and there are some of you out there who are familiar, but the city has been working with us, and they have created a layer in their GIS mapping system that helps identify where gopher tortoise burrows are. And they invite the people of Northport to when they identify where a burrow is, to send via their website, upload a photograph of the location of that burrow. And then the city knows where they are, and they know to stay out of their way when they're doing road maintenance, mowing, and that kind of thing. And if you all are not familiar with how that process works, we have some business cards up here for John Kausbeck, who is with the city, and he will help walk you through the process of using that technology. We're also interested in birds, of course, and just to give you an idea, there's a concentration of birds we've discovered in Northport, and we realized that there was a parcel of land being developed next to it, and we ended up finding out that that land would be developed in some fashion. And so we did get together with the developer, asked if they could leave a nice buffer between where these birds are and that development, and it looks like that's how this will proceed, which is a positive thing. So I ask any of you to, if you ever see anything that doesn't look quite right, or you feel needs some attention, you're concerned about the wildlife, please let us know. And there's ways maybe to work things out. Also, we are interested in starting a canal watch program. So we have, as you probably know, 85 miles of canals in our city, and we have the Nyackahachie Creek. And these waters are where we get our drinking water from. And so we are hoping to start up a canal watch program, at least for looking out for nitrogen. And so we would ask volunteers to do little samples in the waterways on a monthly basis. We need to get some grant money to do that, but so we have some surveys here, and that's an opportunity if you want to get involved with our organization, whether it's Canal Watch or anything else. Please fill it out. We ask you to put your email and phone number down, and we don't share the information, and it's just a way of reaching out to you to let you know when our talks are. And let's see what else. We do have some bumper stickers are up for grabs if anybody's interested. I break for tortoises. And anyway, there's other things. Have a look. And now I'd like to introduce our speaker tonight, Jono Miller. And he's got a long list of things as a background. So he has been a Sarasota environmental educator, activist, volunteer, and consultant for the last 4 decades. He's been a community leader on topics such as environmentally sensitive land protection, neighborhood parkland, voting systems, tree protection, comprehensive planning, coastal issues, cabbage palms, water supply, backyard chickens, and protection of the Nyack River. He's retired now from teaching and directing the environmental studies program at New College of Florida, and aside from working to protect our state park system, He is working on a book about cabbage palms for the University Press of Florida and a movie about the Miaka River, and we will see tonight a little bit of that movie. And now we please welcome Jono Miller.
Thank you, Edie. We may have to adjust the sound, but it's an honor to be here, particularly with two commissioners. There's a lot of history to Northport, and I'm afraid a lot of people aren't aware of it, and I only know part of it, but I will try to share some of what I know. I'm going to tell you what led to this talk. As part of the Miaka Estates settlement, one of the requirements of the Miaka Estates settlement was that a study be done regarding wildlife and fire in Northport. And Edie, I can get a copy of that for you. It talks a lot about wildlife in Northport. And so Julie, my wife, is in the back, and Jean Huffman, who's a dendrochronologist. We all worked on this study in the early 80s, and that's when we first really started spending a lot of time in Northport. Julie and I live in the city of Sarasota, and I can walk to the Sarasota-Bradenton Airport in about 20 minutes. So I don't live here, but I've spent a lot of time here trying to understand what's going on. The second thing is, when I was in graduate school, we had an assignment to write a paper about a community somewhere in Florida, and I chose Northport, and I wrote about the pattern of land development. So those are two pieces of research that I've been involved in. And then the third piece is Marshall Grove's book that he talks about the first 50 years in Northport. So the information you see in this presentation comes from those three sources. So this is the current boundary of Northport, outlined in red. And the area I'm primarily going to be talking about is this area that's in gray. That's this original township and half township. This wasn't part of Northport when we were doing our study, and this is its own separate discussion. So one of the questions we promised to answer when we sent out the promotional material for this talk was, what was Northport like before there was a Northport? And the book, as you know, sort of characterizes it that Northport sprang from a wilderness, but I think most of you know that Native Americans have been here for 20,000 years or whatever, and Anglo-Americans have been here for a long time. And it was in the 1840s, about the time of statehood, that surveyors were first sent through this area to try and describe the landscape. And this is what one of their notes looks like. And so this is one township. Township is 36 square miles, and first they would survey the perimeter of the township, and then they would come back and fill in. And you can see where it's sort of like the game of Battleship. Wherever one of the survey lines crossed a feature, they would make a note. So if there was a pond in the center here, that may not get noticed. But if there was a pond that intersected one of these lines, then they would make a note of that. Now, this technique of mapping land in 36 square mile sections stems from Thomas Jefferson. And in the northern colonies that were settled early, it was relatively easy to describe land by meets and bounds. You would say, well, you go up the creek till you see a big rock, and then you go so many feet in this direction till you hit a stone wall, and then you come back. And so a lot of property was described in that manner. But as the country grew, the government needed to sell land in order to run the government. But this was land nobody had seen. They didn't know where the rocks and the streams were. So they had to come up with a system of dividing the land in a manner that it could be sold, but basically sight unseen. So this system of creating a grid and then giving this section to the railroads or selling this section to Hamilton Diston or this township, that was a system they could use. So this is what some of the notes would look like. And so it takes a while to get, I don't even know, I haven't quite figured this part out. There's some people that deal with these surveyor notes extensively and they can read them easily. But basically, they started in the northeast corner of this one section. They came down 40 chains, which was a half a mile, and set a post. Then at 47, they encountered a creek, and that creek was from 47 to 50, so it was about 198 feet across. And then a little beyond the mile is where they came to the township line. And they described it as third-rate pine land. A lot of the habitat around here, let me get on the other side. A lot of the habitat around here was described as a very poor quality land. So you'll see these descriptions: third-rate pine land, third-rate prairie, third-rate wet prairie, third-rate land. It was not viewed, these were not really, apparently not really tall, well-timbered pine areas. Here they were chaining, and they encountered very high saw palmetto, which was bad for chaining. Now, they made a note of this because apparently in most cases the palmetto was relatively low, and that would have been due to frequent fire. Here they talked about where the ponds were, there would be a little hammock along the edge. And they described a creek called by the Indians Myakkahatchee. In one place where they crossed it, it was 99 feet, in another place it was 79 feet. But again, one of the most distinctive aspects of Northport at that time was how wet it was. And so this description says the whole country is covered with water in the wet season, and they said the whole is one large pond in the rainy season. It was covered with water. They found little salt springs, and they described it as a rivulet of medicinal water that was mildly cathartic. So let me orient you to, you'll all get this. So we have Warm Mineral Springs down here, Deer Prairie Creek, here's Price, the high school, and here's Little Salt Spring. Now what I did was I went and looked at this aerial image from Google Earth, and I tried to identify most of the ditches or drainage features. So you see these blue lines. I didn't get all of them, but these are drainage ways in the city. So the question is, why are they so random looking? Like, it's not a grid. It just seems really happenstance as to where these came from. Well, there's a story, and that story is they were basically connecting the dots. They had to hit every wetland. And so as long as they got to these wetlands, that was part of their drainage scheme. Now this area around Little Salt Spring wasn't drained, but you can see everything else. They basically hit every wetland in this drainage scheme. So if you're trying to understand the pattern of the canals and the drainage system in Northport, you need to go back. This is a 1948 aerial photograph that's available online. I can tell you how to do that later if there are questions. This is Warm Mineral Springs at that time in 1948. So I don't know if you can see it here. Here's Little Salt Spring, and there's an area here with sort of a corduroy effect. And I'm going to enlarge that and change the contrast a little. And I think you can see that there's a lot of parallel rows here. This is some kind of agricultural operation, whether it was row crops or they were simply getting rid of the salt palmettos. I don't know exactly what they were doing, but it's clear that there was an agricultural operation there. And the reason I'm showing you this is that this is a current shot of Little Salt Spring. And if you look, these same rows show up at least 68 years later. So when we talk about our barrier islands and beaches, we say, oh, they're very fragile, blah, blah, blah. You can dig a hole on a beach that's 4 feet deep. I wouldn't recommend it because it's not good for sea turtles, but come back the next day, that hole will be filled in. If you dig a relatively shallow cut in our prairies, 70 years later, you're still going to be able to see this. So these systems, these native habitats, these prairie communities, are actually more sensitive than the islands that we think maybe. So as you know, and I'm not going to get into Warm Mineral Springs, we got Little Salt Spring and Warm Mineral Springs, and these are sort of cousins to other karst features in the region. There's Deep Hole up in the Lower Lake area of Mayac River State Park, and Quezon Lake up in Tatum Sawgrass. This is a historic photograph because his dikes have been put across this thing. It's basically filled in with vegetation, but it's some sort of circular sinkhole or karst feature like these other two that you have in Northport. And there are other springs and related seeps in the area. So just a little bit about, there was a recent USGS report, I imagine the commissioners have seen this, dealing with Warm Mineral Spring. And so these blue dots represent a measured discharge. And so if you're a pessimist, you focus on this general downward trend. And if you're an optimist, you look at these two dots here. Things are pretty bad in like 2012 or 11. But these two dots here are comparable to readings that we were getting back in 1970. And this seems to be pointing upward. So USGS, I think, is guardedly optimistic that efforts to restore aquifer levels elsewhere are helping Warm Mineral Springs, but we'll see. So in the late 1800s, the land having been surveyed, cattle ranching was taking place. Apparently the Knight family tried to fence Warm Mineral Springs. I'm not sure why that was. It may have been to keep the cows from drinking the sulfur water. And a little further north, some landowners thought they had a great potential to grow sugarcane, and so they started a drainage district, and I'll talk about drainage districts a little later. That was up closer to 72. So turpentining was big business throughout Sarasota, very laborious work. There were a number of turpentine camps in Sarasota, but that played out. And by the 1930s, a lot of the land that had been turpentine was then being cut over for timber. So there's not a lot of uncut pine in the center of the county. There's paradoxically, there's more up by the coast. When we were doing our interviews in the 80s, we talked to Cecil Daughtry, and he said that the land originally belonged to a guy named Murdoch. And the story is that Murdoch sent a secretary to look after his interests, and she married a guy named Frizzell. And Frizzell was a pretty shrewd guy. There's this thing called the Murphy Act, which I'll explain in a minute, but Murdoch apparently wasn't too attached to the land, and so Frizzell was able to acquire it. And the Murphy Act, the way it worked is if someone hadn't paid taxes, and you can imagine in the 30s that this was common, if they hadn't paid taxes for 2 years, you could pay 2 years back taxes and get a quitclaim. And then, if the owner still didn't pay taxes for another 2 years, you would just have to pay the back taxes. So people were acquiring land not for the value of the land, but simply for the cost of the back taxes. So as a result, this guy Frizzell ended up owning basically everything between the Peace River and the Mayaca River, and he paid about $250 an acre. So he was into, again, cattle and timber. And we talked about this. So in addition to everything that was in Charlotte County, he acquired a township and a half north, which I've already shown you. And he also owned about 20,000 acres west of the Mayaca River, which the Vanderbilts acquired. And that's another whole story. So what we did in the 80s, Julie and I and Gene Hoffman, was we tried to piece together these 1948 aerial photographs and try to get an understanding of what Northport looked like in 1948. And so what was distinctive about this landscape was that there were a number of sloughs. Now sloughs are a marsh system, a drainage way, but they don't have a channel. So if it had a creek down the center of it, you wouldn't call it a slough. But if it was a broad area of marsh plants that water would flow through, that would be a slough. And so it's basically the same kind of conditions that people talked about in the Everglades. There are a few channels in the Everglades, but there's a lot of sawgrass with water moving through it slowly. So this is a map that we created. This mustardy color was that sort of pasture or improved area. There was another one down here. The darker green were hammock areas. And there was some scrubby flatwoods along Myakkahatchee. Now, the reason that there are frequently really dry, it's sort of paradoxical. Why would you have high, dry soils next to a creek? It seems paradoxical. But there are two things going on there. One is, when the creek would flood, sand would in a major flood, sand would be carried up out of the banks and deposited alongside the creek. And those are what are called natural levees, and so that was part of it. The other thing is that when you're next to a creek, you have better drainage. So the soil was not only drier because it was deeper, but because it was next to a drainage way, and that made it drier. So if you had been looking for scrub jays in Northport at that time, this would have been a good place to look. But the main feature are these, there may have been a channel in Myakkahatchee, but these other blue fingers that are coming through here, these were the sloughs. And it must have been beautiful because it was sort of this corrugated landscape. There'd be a higher land with pine, and then you come upon one of these sloughs and then pine. I imagine it drove the surveyors a little crazy, but it was probably really pretty. So there's Little Salt Spring. So we jump from 1948 to the 50s, and this is when the Mackel brothers get involved. They were in a partnership with something called the Florida-Canada Corporation, which Mr. Grove wrote about, and I hadn't heard about previously. And that sort of morphed into General Development Corporation. Florida-Canada had options on 80,000 acres, so this was probably the Brazil land. And that was sold for $45.37 an acre. And Gary Mormino, in his book, said that, again, confirmed the same price, but he said it was for high and dry acres. Now, you already know that they weren't high and dry acres, particularly in the wet season. So the total was about 3.5 townships. So just to say a little bit about the Mackels, there were 3 brothers, and they controlled not just GDC, but also Gulf American and Deltona. So these were really the preeminent major sort of speculative lot sale guys in the state of Florida. And so they controlled Port Charlotte, Cape Coral, Marco Island, not Rotunda West, that was Kavanaugh, but these 3, I mean, that's 90,000 acres, 1,700, it must be a zero missing there, I think. So anyway, a lot of land in the state of Florida. Here they are, the 3 Mackels. So by the time they sort of played out, there were 5 counties on the Gulf Coast that had major developments: Hernando, Sarasota, Charlotte, Lee, and Collier. And this is a quote from Grove's book. So before Northport was incorporated within the city, within Sarasota County, it was one big development, and it was called Port Charlotte. And the Sarasota County portion was going to be called Charlotte Springs, presumably because of Warm Monroe Spring and Little Salt Springs. And so the port, I think, may have been a little misleading because it made it sound like steamships were going to come in. And it also seemed to feature the Charlotte County name when almost half the land was in Sarasota County. So I need to get back. I've lost the citation for where this came from, but I did read that it was supposed to be a city without taxes. So something for the commissioners to work towards. But what is the analysis is that more than a city without taxes, what was going on was the Mackels wanted to develop the portion in Sarasota County. They went to Sarasota County and said, we want to plat all these lots, and Sarasota County said, whoa, we're not sure that's a great idea. And so they said, okay, be that way, and they formed their own city. So it took 10 days. They had to establish residency, and they incorporated, they started with 5.5 square miles. It would be fascinating for someone to go back and sort of do the sequential map of how Northport grew. So then on June 16th, 1959, there were all the employees of Mackel Brothers, 21 voters. They voted in favor. And, okay, that's the same. So basically, it was a company town, and the Mackels owned all of it. Their employees were the government, and they did what the Mackels told them to do, and it really started to take off. So they annexed 50 square miles, et cetera, et cetera. So basically, their refusal of Sarasota County to allow them to plat wasn't really an obstacle. They went ahead, created their own city, and then platted that. So as you know, GDC stood for General Development. And their goal was to sell lots for $10 down and $10 a month. So here's one of their ads. It shows a lot of their holdings on the East Coast and just one on the West Coast. So there's Port Charlotte. And, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 on the East Coast. First contracts written in late '55. They were selling over 200 home sites a month, and those were $699. And this is right out of Grove's book. In the beginning, they were sorting the mail themselves. In the first full year, they wrote at $2.6 million. In 1957, it was $15.5 million. So here's another ad. It says, if you've ever dreamed of Florida someday, this makes sense now. Because Florida is fast growing, a new family every 8.5 minutes, reserve a home site now. So let's look. This was what they wrote about Port Charlotte, one of the biggest and brightest planned community, the one they planned to do for years. It's on the broad sheltered Charlotte Harbor. Enjoy the private beach. So there is it still called that? There was a Port Charlotte Beach State Park that was given to the state of Florida with the requirement that it be called Port Charlotte Beach State Park. And so people that bought land here were told that they could go to Port Charlotte Beach State Park. They weren't told that it was not contiguous with Northport, that they had to drive across all the Vanderbilt land. But anyway, it was there. Reserve a home site now. Payments are $10 down. Total $795. No assessments. Even the title insurance is free. So you send in your coupon. You get a money-back guarantee if you're not happy within 30 days. And what's interesting here is it says rush map showing location. So basically, I think they picked the lot for you. Julie and I got to know a divorce attorney in Michigan. And his goal was to settle divorces amicably. And he said he would get in and negotiate with people, and they would say, well, honey, you can have the lot in Florida. And they'd say, no, you can have the lot in Florida. there were a lot of lots that were bought for $10 down and $10 a month in Northport. So one of the challenges that Mackles faced was how to subdivide and sell the property. And through time, there have been a wide variety of, most cities, if you think about Manhattan or whatever, the old city farm was typically a grid. And then people came up with a more creative version of the grid. Then curvilinear streets started becoming popular with a few cul-de-sacs, and then eventually cul-de-sacs became trendy. So bear in mind that no part of this Frizzell Ranch in Sarasota County that they bought was above 30 feet in elevation. And in addition, you've seen this slide before, it was wet. The slope for this area was 0.2 of an inch and 100 feet. Okay, and it was raining 52 inches a year basically, but most of that was in the summer. So it was an incredibly wet piece of property and very challenging to develop in any conventional sense. So what the Mackles did was what those Sugar Bowl guys did further north when they wanted to grow sugarcane, was they formed a Northport Charlotte Drainage and Service District. So the drainage districts were a creature of the Florida legislature, and it said that if you had half the landowners, or if the landowners controlled more than half the land, then you could petition to have a drainage district formed. And you would go to the judge, and they would form this corporation, and the voters are the people who owned the land, and then they could basically do what they wanted. So the Mackles had achieved the ability to plat the area by creating their own city, and then they achieved the ability to drain it by taking advantage of this drainage district. And one of the challenges we faced with the Carlton Reserve, which is now the Team Avery Carlton Reserve, when it was the Ringling property, was that there was an existing drainage district on that property, and it could have been exercised, and all the wetlands on the Carlton Reserve could have been drained, so we were able to dodge that bullet. So GBC had to create this system of canals. They had 3 major east-west canals that were 3 miles apart, and then lots of sort of feeder canals. So they bought drag lines that weren't being used on the Mississippi for levee construction, and they had anywhere between 6 to 18 of these drag lines operating at any one time. And Mackel was guaranteeing that the lots were going to be high and dry. So how do you guarantee a high and dry lot in a system that is all underwater in the summer? They needed 175 miles of canals in order to do that. So going back to this, you've seen these sloughs before, and so here's sort of the transformation sequence. You can see the horizontal canals, and then you can start to see how the main canals in North Fork tracked the original sloughs. And then eventually, those sloughs, because it was expensive to build bridges, those sloughs formed, or the canals then, form barriers that help define where neighborhoods are. So if you look at a neighborhood map of Northport, it's a pattern like this. And so you all understand that you can live very close to someone and not be able to visit them very easily because they're on the other side of the canal. This also created real problems because in a conventional city, if you think about whether it's Bradenton or New York City, you have a system of streets and avenues, and even though it's mindless and boring to say you live at the corner of 59th Street and 170th Avenue, at least anybody can find it. They had to come up, their system of street names in Northport, as far as I can tell, has absolutely no pattern whatsoever. So it's not transparent. If you're invited to a party, over here somewhere, there's no obvious way of knowing how it's related to where you're starting from. It's just one of the challenges. So a lot of construction in the 60s. In order to create the high and dry phenomenon, they lowered the roads relative to the surrounding landscape. So anywhere from 6 inches to 3 feet below grade. Now, if you look at a normal road, it's built above grade. You don't want your road base to be wet where a pumping action will deteriorate the road. So this posed problems for the road, but posed other problems as well. Okay, so the roadways inadvertently became part of the drainage system, but more importantly, they lowered the water tables. Just like we talked about the scrub lands next to the creek, when you have a low area next to a high area, the water's going to migrate down there. That had the effect of drying out the pine flatwoods and other habitats, and that contributed to it being drier, which contributes to fire. There was an accumulation of fuel, which contributes to fire. And on the roads and canals acted as fire breaks, which meant that once a fire started, it didn't spread very far. So even if there may have been lightning strikes or fires caused by people, they weren't burning as much acreage. So the result was Northport became more and more sort of incendiary. And what happened was when fires would take place, they'd be more devastating. The fires that hadn't killed pine trees previously, because they were frequent and low intensity and there wasn't much fuel, then became catastrophic fires that did kill the pine trees. And that's probably what this slide says. So here's data from the 70s, and fewer fires, and this continued. But there were some really catastrophic big fires in Northport, and that was part of the interest in wanting us to do that study. So in addition to the fire, there was a rainfall issue of 52 inches a year, but there was also the upstream component. So this is from the 78 plan, and it's talking about water management practices on ranches and groves located on higher ground north of the city drain tailwater into the city. So here is this outline is the Big Slough watershed. Here's that township and a half of Northport, and here's the rest of the basin. And in this map series, it's a little counterintuitive. The red areas are the really wet areas. It probably might have been easier to make them blue, but that's what's really wet. So you can see Northport is reasonably dried out in the original township and a half. There's some wet areas along Myakkahatchee. This area, including Orange Hammock, very wet, and then a lot of wet to the north. And so here's what we're looking at. This is the current portion of Northport. This purpley area is land that's been protected by Sarasota County, and I was fortunate to be at your opening of your new bridge that enables you to go from Akahatchee up into the Carlton. That's really exciting. So this is protected. This red area here is current agriculture land, and this is owned by Mosaic Chemical. So I've told people in the past that no city in the state of Florida stands more to lose from phosphate mining than Northport, because you guys are downstream of Mosaic. And what they do up here in terms of groundwater, surface water, has the potential to affect not only Sarasota County lands, but also Northport. And you can get with Alan Hale later if you want to find out more about Mosaic, but this is something you need to know about. So this little square here is 9 square miles of orange hammock, and this map, you can just see the preponderance of wetlands. There is some dry prairie, which is a globally imperiled habitat, but basically it's a very wet site. It retains many of the original characteristics of Northport before it was drained. And with today's laws, it'd be a lot more problematic to develop, which is why when they had the auction, none of the big guys who are the big developers in the region and the state bid on the property. This is from Grove's book. It says, the rain in Northport started to crumble in '86 when homeowners began to file lawsuits claiming the company sold overvalued properties. And criminal charges were filed. This, I just copied this entire page from his book primarily because I don't fully understand it. But these guys were ordered to be released. And then I'll read this to you, and someone can explain it to me later. Mackle III said GDC's downfall was its emphasis on highly profitable land sales instead of home sales. This resulted in the creation of fully developed lots in numbers far in excess of the demand of end users, he said. Lots were sold to speculators and investors who, instead of building homes, placed them on the resale market. Thus, they were still selling years after the earlier lots sold came back on the resale market. The solution was to increase the price of the homes they were selling and offer the lot buyer the option to trade their lot back as down payment on the house at the current GDC price of the lot. This shifted the lot value to the home value, where cost comparison was hard to make. The salesman could say that the lot value was guaranteed by the company's willingness to take it back as a deposit. And their land sales boomed under this program. So they eventually had to set up this restitution fund. They had to reorganize, and finally in 2002, GDC, or its Atlantic Gulf Communities, was dissolved. There's also been continuing problems with water. Grove says that in the '92 storm, the national TV networks were showing it, and that a third of the homes were surrounded by water, meaning that the streets were functioning as the drainage ways that were implicit. So I thought I'd just take a moment to once again show you this sort of transformation from the original pattern of sloughs into a portion of the current Northport. So again, we've got the Akahatchee coming down here, and sort of the future alignment of 41, I believe. And we're going to look at this little segment. So I'll enlarge that. Okay, so what we're looking at here, you can see these wetlands, and the wetlands were sort of aligned in this linear manner. And so, as suggested by these purple arrows, when there was a lot of rainfall, the water would fill this wetland and then come down through this slough with no channel and into this system. And so water was just generally moving south through the system. And in a really, as the surveyor said, if it was a particularly wet time of year, all of it would be covered with water. It was just the depth of the water would differ. So here are those sort of deeper wetlands. And then we had broader areas. These would have been not as wet. and then other shallower sort of wet prairie areas as well. And the rest of this habitat where you see the trees sprinkled around, those would be scattered pine trees. Now probably where you see this dark stuff, there were probably hammocks along some of the edges of some of the wetlands, as the surveyors noted. So let's go back and forth here. So here we have the original drainage, and then when the engineers working for Mackel needed to get the drag lines busy, they came up with their own solution. So instead of coming down this way, they diverted water over from there. But this one canal sort of tracks that. So here the purple lines show where the canals were dug, and here's where we are today. So if you own a home in this part, this was all a big, open, wet slough that would have been flooded for a fair percentage of the year. That's the end, but I have one quiz. Now, how many of you were here in 1970? Oh my. Well, I'm dating myself. So the question is, what were the landmarks between Venice and the Charlotte County line in 1970? And this is from my memory. There was Basketville, there was Cook's Portland, Playmore on the south side of the river at the Mac River itself, the statue of the Three Graces or whatever at Ormond Springs. There was a GDC tower, a big wooden tower, and there was a police hall of fame. And when you tell people there was a police hall of fame, a lot of people go, yeah, I don't think so. It was there. It was on the south side of the road. I never went in, probably because I'd just gotten out of college. But anyway, so if you want to turn on some lights, I'd be happy to answer some questions. But I do have a movie I'd like to show you about the Mac River. Yes?
I noticed that my husband's family has owned property here. They're going 61. It goes back to 61. But I noticed as we drive around, the historical pattern of naming the streets after World War I battles, battleships, commanders. So they were clearly targeting the veterans who had come back in the late 50s, early 60s, because those names, I keep going, oh yeah, that was a battleship.
Right.
Yeah, that's the Navy section. They have all these things dealing with Navy battles.
We, in the neighborhood Julie and I live in, there's streets named for guns. There's Remington, Winchester, Fox, and they're really desperate for names. Other questions or comments? Yes?
Well, you mentioned Mosaic.
Yes.
And everybody's, I guess, is familiar with what happened in Polk County with the gypsum, radioactive gypsum, and so on. Is that kind of potential issue is something Northport might face with something breaking free and then inundating the sloughs and coming this direction?
Well, first of all, as a result of county employees like Jeff Linzer and the Herald Tribune, writers like Alan Horton, Sarasota County adopted a very stringent mining ordinance. It's unlikely, even though there's phosphate in Sarasota County, it's unlikely it'll be mined. Now, ways that we know there's phosphate mined in Sarasota County is if you go to Venice Beach, which is a headland, when you're finding those fossil shark's teeth, that's the same Bone Valley strata. If you go down, the phosphate was first discovered in the 1880s in both the Peace River and the Mac River, and the Mac River was actually mined for phosphate. So there is phosphate, there's probably phosphate under Mac Park. So it's unlikely that the clay settling areas, which we used to call slime ponds, or the processing facilities will actually ever be located in Sarasota County. But I don't know if there's an easy way to go back. I'll just tell you that there is mining in the existing mining in Manatee County, phosphate mining, and there's proposed additional mining. Now there was going to be a big hearing about it, and then this sinkhole formed under their slime pond, and they said, oh, maybe we'll have that hearing in January sometime. So that was put off. The material that went down the sinkhole is acidic and probably has a number of other nasty things in it, but it is moving relatively slowly. That I don't think is ever going to get this far south. But obviously, you just never know. And let me give you an example. This is sort of an analogy rather than a direct comparison. There were a number of sinkholes that formed a few years ago, and it was right after or during a freeze, and Swift Mud had calculated how many hours it was likely to have really severe cold weather. And the reason they did that is that the strawberry growers up in Hillsborough County pump water on the strawberries. And it's counterintuitive, but if you put ice on the strawberries and keep adding water, the additional water will go into freezing rather than killing the plant. So they've pumped a lot of water. Well, they completely misunderstood how many hours there would be, and these guys pumped water for days, like 3 days, and that affected the aquifer, and a number of sinkholes occurred as a result. Now, likewise, the Water Management District has assumptions about what the worst rainfall event could be, but they can't plan for everything. So imagine if we had a really wet summer and everything was completely saturated to start with, and then we had a tropical depression or a hurricane. There could be a lot of water that would then be coming down into Northport from the big sluice system. And exactly how it would behave or what would be in it, historically, these slime ponds would fail and they would pollute the LFI River or the Peace River, and this material would just get away, and it was like milk or magnesia washing down the river, would kill all the wildlife. So, unlikely, yes, but there's a 100-year storm, there's also a 500-year storm and a 1,000-year storm, and people don't plan for those events, but when they happen, they have really big effects. So, by and large, I think you're in pretty good shape, but I also think you really need to monitor what Mosaic's doing and be involved in that process. Other questions? Yes?
All the canals have water management features, weirs, and some gates. So was that part of GDC? Did they do that, or?
I believe so, yeah. That's my understanding. And I should go back and research this. It's sad but true. GDC actually set aside parklands, certain parcels that were going to be parks, and those got lost in the shuffle along the way somehow. And so your parks people are having to go back and sort of retroactively cobble together park opportunities where there actually had been intention originally to have those. Yes?
That square that Mosaic owns,
Yes.
do you know, does that include the headwaters of the Mayaca? I think I read that in the paper a couple months ago. Of the Mayacahatchee.
Yeah, that is our water system.
And that's in that square that they're going
We
Right.
want
to.
to extend up with East Wingate, that here will be in Manatee County Commission, and it does involve us. If they extend it and when they dig a mine, it can go down as much as 30 to 60 feet to hit the aquifer. And if it dries up the Mayacahatchee, you put the rest together.
But yeah, so do you know when in January that's going to be? I think
No, it'd be
everybody in
April.
this room could send an
January
email
or
to the
December.
commissioners, and I know you can send
Yeah,
the
I think it's
commissioners
in
in
January,
Manatee County
and
and say, please don't do that.
yeah.
Please don't, because isn't that true? The commissioners have to approve it? The
Yeah.
Manatee counties, I mean, because they do own the land. So, but the commissioners do
It's
have to
interesting
approve.
that something a couple of counties away affects us.
So drastically. Yeah, that's,
Any
thank
other
you.
thoughts? Yes.
What do you think there's climate change prediction for me for Northport?
Well, I just had a column in the Herald Tribune yesterday or the day before. I don't know. I think Port Charlotte and South Gulf Cove have a lot bigger problems than Northport. I didn't show. Let me just close your eyes for a minute while I go through here. I think I had an image. Oh, there we go. I lost it. Okay.
Number 7.
All right. Yeah. Hold on, let's turn this up. The part of the problem with Mayaca Estates. Let me. You can turn the lights on.
Like,
oops, sorry.
part of the problem with Mac Estates was that that portion on the west side of the river where the state forest is a lot lower than most of your part of Northport. And the regional planning councils and others are really concerned that putting a lot of people in there when we already had things like Rotunda and South Gulf Cove and Port Charlotte was just really tempting fate. And so luckily, you know, if you go and look, just as I showed you those striations in the land near Little Salt Spring, if you look at the Mayaca State Forest, you will see the alignment of the curvilinear roads that GDC had bulldozed to move forward with that development. And it was only sort of the collapse and some of these legal challenges that ended up creating a situation where that could be acquired for the state forest. And you have the only state forest in the city in the state of Florida. So the current predictions, the current thoughts are between 1 and 4 feet of sea level rise by the end of the century. Some people think it could be as much as 6 feet. I don't think it's, I think where you're going to see it is along the Mac River and along Big Slough and Deer Prairie Slough, these tributaries. As the water level comes up, it's going to be changing the habitat adjacent to the creeks. There's a really sad situation, and I imagine Linda knows about this. Because Port Charlotte, the Charlotte County portion of what was the former this GDC development, is so low, they can't really do hurricane shelters there, but they can't transfer money from there to Sarasota County or Northport to build those shelters here. So you're going to have, if you think about it, there are going to be people from Gasparilla, Cape Hayes Peninsula, Port Charlotte, all coming north to try and get away from a storm. And obviously the storm tides are going to be aggravated by higher sea level. So that's part of the big push to work on River Road. If you think about it, it's really sad that when the Cape Hayes Peninsula was developed, we ran the major roads down the edges. If the road had gone down the center, it would have been drier. But we have the roads closer both to the Gulf and to the Mayaca. So I think hurricane evacuation may be one way that it affects you, and I think it'll affect the margins. But I think for most of the lots in Northport, that's not going to be a problem. One more, and then we'll do the movie. Yes?
The environmentally sensitive lands oversight. There's a, what is it? Penny option sales tax or something that is set aside for parking and environmentally sensitive lands.
Yes.
Does that apply to the city of Northport? Because it doesn't
Yes,
seem like
let
they
me,
have any,
yes.
they don't seem to have any recommendations in Northport very often.
Well, okay, let me just talk about that for a second. So the voters of Sarasota, including Northport voters, approved most recently a referendum that did two things. It was a $250,000, and 60% of that money was to go for environmental land, and 40% was to go for what's called neighborhood parkland. And the reason we have two programs is we started with an environmental land program, and in that process we kept bringing us sites that were really interesting and probably worth protecting, but they didn't meet the criteria. So we said, well, why don't we also have a way to buy parkland that's not necessarily in great shape environmentally. So the money exists, and both the park, both the committee that makes recommendations about the neighborhood parkland money and the environmentally sensitive lands group, and I serve on both of them, are try to be very cognizant of the contributions of the municipalities. So you can imagine the city of Sarasota has contributed a lot of money because of their tax base to the environmental land program, but there's very little environmental land to buy in the city of Sarasota. So we've tried to be sensitive. It didn't work out that well, or maybe it worked out as the way you wanted, but we tried to partner on the acquisition of more mineral springs, so there was a commitment there. I think the county is moving forward to try and acquire the 9 square miles of Orange Hammock, which would be a major expenditure, some of which is probably going to come out of that fund. And we're having our next meeting of the park group is going to be, I think what we've already been talking about, your effort to acquire additional lots along Macahatchee Creek. And so the tax dollars that Northport citizens are contributing to the county for neighborhood parkland, I expect in the near future, most of that money will be going to improving that Macahatchee corridor, and most of the money that Northport people are contributing for environmental lands will be going hopefully to acquisition of Orange Hammock. So I'm going to stop here and show you this. It's just a 14-minute movie.